Hey folks, welcome to part 2 of our look at Geo, the new Red Giant tool for creating great 3D very quickly and easily. Now the outline of this tutorial is very similar to part 1. We're going to be looking at materials and meshes and cloning and all that kind of stuff and environment and stuff. We're just going to be digging a little bit deeper than we did in the first tutorial. I strongly recommend watching that one first before coming here, or you might be a little bit lost. But assuming you did that, let's just go ahead and jump in. I have this really cool project from Something's Awry from our April 2024 launch video. And this is actually using two different layers of Geo. We have the table and then the stuff on top of the table because there's so many objects and materials here. And what I'm mostly concerned about here is creating glass and making beautiful glass, because I think that's one of Geo's real strengths, because rendering glass is just one of the things that CG stuff, you have to do a lot of really intense calculations and it's very, very slow to get something beautiful. And Geo really shines when creating reflections and refractions and glass, as we'll see. So I have here the stuff on the top. These little globes here, these spheres, are supposed to be glass. So let's open up our material settings. I know that the M1 refers to these little gold buckles. So I can go to Orb Gold Diffuse here. I'm not going to bother to load up all the maps. I'm not really concerned with getting them all right. I believe that M2 is our orb. One of the tricks I like to do, because we don't have the names of what the objects are here, is I'll just like take down the opacity value to 0, and that way I could see what's on that material, that particular group of properties. And so as I take this down to 0, I can see, okay, this is where my glass spheres are. So I'll crank that back up to 100. Now, we want these orbs to be see-through, so let's crank up transmission weight so light can shine through them. Let's take roughness down to like 3, something like really low. And now we have something that's starting to look reflective, but we are also missing some key components here. And what's going on is that this is reflecting the HDR map. And what we need to do is we need to set up a refraction map. When you have clear glass like this, it's not going to look right until you set up the refraction map in the environment. So when you're doing kind of more advanced material stuff, especially transparent stuff, you're going to be going back and forth between the environment and the materials section quite a bit. So what I'm going to do is change this refraction map to custom, and I'm going to change the custom refraction map to my workshop background here. That's basically the background layer. And now we can see the background inside of the reflections here. And I might take this to effects and mask just in case I added any color grading on there. I didn't, but whatever. So that's there now. Also, I'm going to go ahead and add this to the environment map. I'm going to say custom, same map, workshop background here. And now you can see the difference that makes, because the table and this lamp, this light here, they don't have that environment. And you can see what a difference it makes even in like the ambient light that we're getting on these two objects. They composite better into the scene already, even without materials. Anyways, let's go back to our materials here. If I increase the index of refraction, the IOR, the default is 1.55. I took it down to 1 because I want it to be just kind of like see-through glass. But if I took it down to like 1.55, you'd see some really interesting and gorgeous refractions happening here. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this back to 1 because, again, I want it to be transparent. There's not like liquid in here or anything. Another thing also that helps with reflection sometimes is metalness. And it's really weird because, glass isn't metal, but as I take this up to 100%, you see the kind of reflections that we have here. And maybe now we could give this a little bit more index of refraction here if we wanted to, and we're getting some kind of like bounces from the background. I actually like this better at 1 in this case, but this is absolutely beautiful. Now in this case, I don't want it absolutely beautiful. I want to muck it up a little bit. So I'm going to go to the base color map and I'm going to choose orb color. And that's going to completely knock that out. That's okay. I'm going to go to the roughness map. I'm going to choose orb roughness. And finally, I'm going to go to transmission weight and I'm going to choose orb transmission. Actually, maybe I don't want that orb color in there. I'll just choose none for now. Now, sometimes with maps, you can't really see what's going on here because I have this roughness so low, so it's not really using that map. In order to really see that, I need to take this all the way up to 100%, and now we're seeing that. So basically, this roughness map is creating kind of like these smudges, which creates this like beautiful kind of frosted glass effect. And especially when we have that in our transition weight and have transition weight up all the way, we can really see that it's affecting how much light is able to go through these orbs. Now, most of these maps that we're using for this here are grayscale maps, and we can break the rules. We can use these maps for other properties. So for example, the emission color map, emission, if we click on this color swatch, it's going to raise the emission. Let's say I'm going to bring this up to pink. We'll talk more about emission in just a second, but I have this set to pink here, and anything other than black, as we raise that value up, it's going to illuminate that particular material. But I could also, in the emission color map, I'm going to use let's say the roughness map. I'll use the roughness map in the emission color. And what that's going to do is it's going to have the emission only show up in those areas, which creates this kind of like eerie, glowy effect, which complements the frosted glass really nicely, I think. I'm going to go back to my pink and maybe make it a little bit brighter here. And maybe instead of using the roughness, maybe we might want to use the transmission map. There we go. And maybe then we'll bring this back down a little bit. So we can play with these different maps until we get the result that we're looking for, something that we like. And there's just so much power to play with here. Here's what I came up with in the final version. And I just love the way that this looks. And I love the fact that this is live 3D inside of After Effects. Now, I mentioned that we can use emission without maps, and we absolutely can. Here's just a quick example of that. I have this little LED bulb, and this is obviously turned off. But if I go into the emission color, pretty sure that this is take this down to 0 opacity. Yeah, that's the one we want. I'm going to undo that. Now I could take the emission color to something besides black, which is no emission, and I could make the entire thing, this whole coil, glow. So maybe I do want this kind of warm, orangey look. So I bring this up here, you can see, yeah, we have this nice illumination. I've got a little bit of optical glow on here as well, but you can see that this really makes things just kind of glow. This is obviously a light bulb that has been turned on, and this emission color can get us there without any maps or anything else. Now, another important attribute here in this group of properties is the subsurface weight. I'm going to go ahead and open up this SSS start. SSS stands for subsurface scattering. And that is the idea that we have light hitting a surface and then it scatters underneath it. And it creates kind of like a depth to it. So if you think of like a candle or something like jade, some type of materials like that, you can see that light kind of doesn't just hit the surface and bounce off, it goes underneath it. And a lot of times when we've been working with human characters in 3D, in After Effects, we're very limited because most tools don't have this subsurface scattering. So no matter how we light it, it's always going to feel fake because we have too much reflection. The shadows are too deep. It just doesn't feel like it's lit like real human skin. So I can go ahead and select this. Let's go over to the materials, and I might want to bump up the roughness to maybe 70. And that gets us a little bit more just of a matte finish, which is a little bit more like human skin tone. Amateur CG stuff is always too reflective to me. Whenever I see CG stuff from 20 years ago, it's always just everything is just so shiny. It's ridiculous. It's a pet peeve of mine. Anyways, so I take this up to 70, 75 even. So it's just kind of more of a matte finish clay look. And then watch this. When I bump up subsurface weight, we start to bring in some light into those shadow areas. And it's basically making it so that the light goes underneath the surface a little bit. And we get this really, really beautiful example. We can take it up to 50, even 70%. It's really a matter of taste. There's not a, do this number for human skin tone. But compared to the original with no subsurface scattering, it's just night and day. So enough about materials. We've dug pretty deep here. Let's move on to talking more about cloning. Now, in the last tutorial, we looked at creating clones. And as we dig into this in Geo, there's actually a little bit more than meets the eye here, which is pretty interesting, I think, with the clones. If we open up the cloner section here in Geo, if we play with these clones, something very interesting happens. If I take down uniform scale, you'll notice that the phones in the center are not really changing as much as the phones on the edge. And that's because transforms in this section, when you're doing clone transforms, it weights the changes so that the ones towards the center are affected less than the ones on the outside. So as we rotate this here, there we go. The ones on the outside rotate a bunch, and the ones in the center don't rotate as much. That allows us to do some really interesting, cool dynamic effects with clones that we couldn't otherwise. So if we were just going to rotate this and they all rotated the same, it'd be the same as rotating global rotation, right? It'd be the same thing as rotating things like up, down, that way, or whatever. But because of this interesting weighted thing, we can create these cool like wave effects or other type things. Now you might be saying, like I did initially, like, well, what if I do want to adjust the size of all the clones uniformly? And actually, let me undo this, get this back here. And let's say I want to resize these all and not just the ones on the edges, or have this kind of like weighted type thing. Well, for that, just go back into the geometry section and adjust things that way. So if you want the entire, like all the phones to rotate in unison like this, and that's not weighted, then use this rotation. If you want it to scale all perfectly the same, then use this one in the geometry section where it's affecting your source geometry and not the one here in the cloner. Again, as you can tell by that example, I could play with these clones all day because they render so quickly, and you're able to create these really interesting shapes, especially with like all the metal and the reflectivity and stuff that in CG that it's just kind of hard to picture how gorgeous that's really actually going to look, because you don't have these real-time reflections, and the geometry slows down considerably in a CG app when you're playing with these clones. But here in Geo, you could move these around, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. One of my favorite projects that I've seen in Geo. So fun to play with this. Now, there's another category here called Clone Randomizer, and this is great. I'm just going to switch projects here. I'm going to go over to my asteroid belt start. We have one little lonely asteroid here, has some bump maps and some lighting and such. If I go to Cloner, enable Cloner, we have a box clone. Again, we can take this to cylinder or whatever we want. And I might try sphere, because I haven't used sphere that much in these tutorials. And look at this. You get some real geometric shapes. Also how fast that renders. Oh my gosh. I just like sneeze on this and it makes like a million extra clones. Look at that. That's so cool. Anyways, what I want to do here is maybe make a few more on the x-axis. Maybe just like a little bit, like 4, something like that. And then what I can do is go into the Clone Randomizer and use this to create a random asteroid field. So I can use randomize position X to randomize this just horizontally, Y just vertically, Z coming at me. Now you could definitely at this point start seeing that even though the randomization is great, the depth is great, that they're all facing the same way. So we could randomize the rotation on every axis. There we go. We could also randomize uniform scaling. If we wanted to kind of like scale these in one dimension or another, we can do that so that they kind of randomize that way. And this one's really interesting. You could randomize the tone. So like the color of each one, we could bump that up and you could see what's happening. Those ones in the back are getting shifted a bit in terms of their tone and color. So we can create, I would probably go up to individual size here and maybe spread this out like a little bit more. And maybe we want to increase uniform scale like more than that. And then maybe we want to go into our geometry settings, like I was saying just a moment ago, take this down to like 20%. So we have a little bit smaller asteroids. Maybe we want to add some more. Yeah, anyways, I don't need to like keep playing with this while you're all waiting here. But now we have this three-dimensional asteroid field that we can adjust. We can move it in 3D. I actually, in the final version, I had like this real lens flares. I set up Geo to be the obscuration layer so that when it moved out of the way of the flare, which is here, that it kind of like blossoms on like this in an organic way. It's really fun. And you can see the camera move, kind of like pushing through these asteroids. It's really cool what you could do with Geo. Oh, I should also mention, I'm going to go back here. Sometimes with Geo, you start to see these little anti-aliasing artifacts, or maybe it's not anti-aliased strong enough. So what we could do is go into the rendering section and we can change anti-aliasing to best. We could also enable MLAA and oversample. If we have texture maps that are kind of creating like a little bit of a sizzle, we could increase texture smoothing. Maybe I'll take that up to like 1.5. That might be a little bit. Yeah, it smooths things out just a little bit because we are using some textures for our bump and diffuse on these rocks. Another thing to be aware of, if you get some interesting color artifacts, like if there's just like random like yellow and blue squares appearing out of nowhere or something else like that, change color maps and render. Right now they're set to render linear, but you could also render in a video color space as well. And I find that this solves so many of those issues that I've run into when it comes into color gamuts and such. And again, here's my rendered version of these cloned asteroids. Now, one last thing I want to show you here, a cool trick with materials. I have my gears and I'm going to go into the materials section and I'm going to go into material 1. And we talked before in the last tutorial about the shaders and how we're going to stick to the physically based ones, but there are a few cool options in here that can come in handy. For example, we can render this as just colors only or just as the normals. But what I want to focus on here is the depth. We can choose to render this based on the depth. And you'll notice that it works in conjunction with the cloner. And it's actually giving me the depth of each of these gears, the M1 gears, going back. So they're basically, it's a luminance readout. The brighter that the color is, the closer we are to camera. The darker it is, the further away it is from the camera. And we could use that for several cool things that we'll see in just a moment. Now, there are 3 gears in this setup, one on M1, M2, and M3. And to avoid going in and having to click and set this up for each shader, what I could do is change the material assignment from per mesh to one for all. And then when I set up this one material, it applies to all of the objects in M1 through M5 at the same time, which is really handy. And also another thing that I typically do with levels effects is I go in and I add like the levels adjustment or something like that and adjust the brightness to make this so that this is closer in the foreground, this is brighter, and then the stuff in the background is darker. But we don't have to do that because we can adjust the near and far colors here. And you'll see here as I fiddle with near and far that I'm able to control the brightness of the foreground objects as well as the background objects. So once you have the depth shader looking the way you want it, we can use this as a map for, well, a bunch of things actually. But what we're going to do is use it to simulate depth of field. And so what I would do is duplicate this layer. So Command D, Control D, call this depth. And then you want to make sure that you do this as a final step, because if I go back and I change my source geo project, then the depth is not going to match up. Like if I added more clones or shifted the size of the cloner or something like that, then the depth map is not going to line up. So what I did in this final example, we'll just jump to that. I have the regular geo, which is visible, and then I have the depth map, which is not visible. There's a glow adjustment layer that's being affected by. If I just solo that, you can just see what that looks like. There we go. And then what I can do is on this fake depth of field layer, I have a camera lens blur effect applied. This is a native After Effects effect. This also works for the universe effect bokeh, which is really cool. But I can use this depth layer, make sure you have this set to effects and masks, but I could use that depth layer to control the blur. And you can see I have the blur focal distance animated, and that's going to allow me to do like a rack focus if I wanted to, using that depth map as like a focal plane. Now, that's all the tutorial for Geo specifically, but there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do in After Effects to get the most out of your experience with Geo. And for this, I'm just going to make a brand new project, and I'm going to go to File, New, and Maxon Cinema 4D File. And I'm just going to, yeah, untitled is fine, even though that's humiliating and embarrassing. And that's going to launch Cinema 4D for us. Now, I just made a new blank Cinema 4D file. You can add stuff here if you want to, but what I want to show you is this. When you have a C4D file, I'm just going to make a new comp with it. You'll see I have nothing else in my entire project. No compositions, no anything else, nothing. And when you have a Cinema 4D file, even a blank Cinema 4D file, it applies the Cineware effect in After Effects to render the Cinema 4D file. And this Cineware effect keeps getting more and more powerful. It now can use redshift data, it can cache simulations, you can extract different components of your scene. All of the objects will show up in this object list. You can select them and delete them from here. You can create a null so you can transform them separately. There's just so much that this amazing little plugin can do these days. And my favorite probably is the addition of the asset browser. So I can click on the asset browser to launch that here. And this is actually the same thing as the asset browser here. So you see what that looks like in Cinema 4D, all these different models and textures and such. And then now in After Effects, we have access to all that stuff too. So we have, arts and crafts. You want to get some buttons you want to add, or if you want to add a nice bed to create a bedroom scene with a 3D bed, you can add all that stuff here in the Cineware effect in After Effects. You don't need to open up Cinema 4D. It's like different food items, all kinds of stuff from right here inside of After Effects. Now, if we create something here in the asset browser, and I'll actually just create that over here in this side. So let's say I'll make this classic bed. Now, if we want to use this in After Effects, you used to have to go to File, Save for Cineware. So it needed a specific thing. But they've since changed the Cineware engine, as I understand it. So that's why you can render Redshift. If you have a license for Redshift, you could render Redshift from Cinema in After Effects through Cineware. And that works, which is really cool. It's really just the Cinema 4D engine inside of After Effects. And so you don't need to save for Cineware anymore for Cineware, but for Geo, you do need to save for Cineware. So if we're going to use this bed in some way in After Effects or with this Cineware effect, we don't need to save for Cineware. If we are going to use it with Geo, with Trapcode Particular, with Mirror, we do need to save for Cineware. Also note that you'll need to bake in any animation, deformers, that type of thing. Also be aware, if I open up that phone model again, here's the phone model we've been using, that there's a normal tag on the phone. When we don't have a normal tag and we bring it into Geo, we tend to get faceting along the edges. And so just adding a normal tag, just like right click and just add, right click and then type normal under the modeling category, just add a normal tag. That's it. And Geo will bring this over and smooth the geometry. It will look so much better. And finally, one other After Effects thing, we could actually use Geo in a Mogurt that we create. This will allow you to take your work from Cinema 4D over into Adobe Premiere, for example, and adjust it in 3D in Adobe Premiere, which is pretty cool. So thanks for joining me, folks. It's a fun ride. I'm so excited to see what the community creates with Geo. I'm Chad Perkins. Again, thanks for watching. Take care.